Okay, good morning, everybody. About to get started on this lecture on global poverty. Um, One thing I thought I would go ahead and do is make a couple of quick announcements for those of you who are actually watching these. First thing is that we've got starting on Thursday this week for the first time. You're going to be not watching the videos, or those of you who are watching the videos, there won't be any videos. I will be, per your suggestion, I will be posting written questions on the Brooks and Woolforth book, which then this would be the absolute last reminder that you need to get that book. But I will be posting questions for each of the relevant sections of the book. Be posting those Thursday morning class time and then next Tuesday class time. Those two will be, the hope will be that those will help you in writing your book critiques. I should note also that I will be commenting. I'm going to say this all, but just so you know what's coming up, I will be commenting, responding to student comments on those, but I'm going to give you 48 hours to do it. And that's an incentive because you're going to need to get them in if you want to get the book critiques done. And the one next Tuesday, I'll probably just say 24 hours. Yeah, the first one I'll say 48 hours because that'll be Thursday this week. But the one due on the questions on Tuesday, I'll say 24 hours because you need to be able to take those into account when you're actually writing your book critique. So that's the first thing. First announcement is that this is the last lecture, and so after this, it'll just be those online discussions. The other thing, just while I'm thinking of it, is not sure if I said this before, but just in case. So the Brooks and Woolforth book, of course, you're writing your book critique on, but it will also be fair game for the final exam. So 3 questions roughly per day, 3 to 4 questions per day. So it'll behoove you to, have done that carefully. And then I mentioned that the final will take place as scheduled on Thursday, April 30th. It starts at 8:30 and it ends at 11. Both of those times are hard, so I will set up the exam to have a start at 8:30 and not before, and then it will end at 11. Of course, you can start later than 8:30, but that will be less time. It will be open book, open note. I'm going to ask that people not communicate with each other while they're taking the exam, but otherwise, in terms of everything you have, you'll be able to use what you have to do as well as you possibly can on the exam. And hopefully what that's going to mean, I am positive about this, is that we will have a pretty high mean and I won't have to add points to scores, but we'll see. Never having done this before. Okay, so this is our last lecture today. Good fun. So we're going to talk about global poverty. I'm going to cover, this is the overview, so I'm going to talk about both kind of recent trends in recent medium-term trends in global poverty, the current state of it, and the status quo of U.S. foreign aid. Then we're going to spend most of the class, most of the lecture today, talking about explanations of Southern poverty. So the 3 that you see listed there, that's the plan. So getting into this discussion of global poverty and foreign aid. So, oops. Okay, sorry about that. There was a little glitch with the, I was trying to take something off the screen that was distracting me, and instead I messed up the screen size. Sorry. Okay, so one of the really interesting things to note here is this great, I think we could all admit, overall trend, which is the reduction of the percentage of the global population in extreme poverty. So you see there the numbers: 1990, 36% of the planet's population was in extreme poverty, defined as less than $1.90 a day. That has varied over time in terms of where that threshold is. But in 2017, down from 36% to 6.62%. That's really, really fundamental. And a lot of that happened actually in East Asia and in Latin America, but even parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to be the place on the planet with the greatest problem for extreme poverty. And even there, though, we've seen this reduction where it was 60% of Sub-Saharan Africa in 1990 in extreme poverty, and that's down to, it's cut about in half, so it's down to about 30% of the population in 2017. So really remarkable. And part of that is, we've talked about globalization a couple of times, good and bad. One of the benefits of globalization is that it has had this effect. However, we still do have a problem, right? 30% of Africa is still in extreme poverty. 6.62% of the global population still is in poverty. And then you see there 6.3 million children younger than 5 died. And most of these are from, relatively accessible, health problems that would be solvable, rather, if they had more, their governments had more resources. So malnutrition, pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, etc. And then in terms of thinking about what we mean by poverty, right? So one thing is this extreme poverty, $1.90 a day. But the other thing I think that's useful in terms of thinking about poverty is to think about what kind of other countries look like relative to the United States. So you have 2018 World Bank numbers of per capita GDP. So per capita GDP takes the whole wealth of the entire country and divides it by the population, right? So the United States is at roughly $60,000 is the per capita GDP. And then with the other countries, it's all adjusted for local prices. So it gives you a sense of kind of what people can need to buy, right, relative to their, the prices that they face, and what the income means relative to the prices that they face in terms of buying food, etc. Right? So China, pretty drastic difference between China and the United States. And we talked about that their economy is growing. They're over half the size of the United States in terms of their overall economic weight, but they've got a massive population to divide that across. India, also talked of as a kind of rising and emerging economic superpower. They've got about half, actually less than half, of the per capita GDP of China. Pretty striking difference there. And then you start to get into the bottom area, Afghanistan, that we think of as a pretty poor country, and that's been one of the challenges in terms of providing stability there, at around $2,000 per capita GDP, so just a fraction even of then, or what, a little more than a quarter of India's. And then Central African Republic, one of the countries near the bottom, I think it's like bottom 10 or bottom 5 of per capita GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity, that is adjusted for local prices. So that gives you a sense of the range. So one thing we often talk about, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of the class today, but is how much the United States spends on foreign aid and whether we spend too much, whether we spend too little. We talked about defense spending earlier in the semester, and one of the discussions when the U.S. has these debates with its allies about burden sharing and how much they're spending on defense, the allies often say, not always, but depending on the ally, but many of those allies are going to say, look, we spend, in relative terms, we spend a lot more on foreign aid than you guys do. Right, they may spend less on defense, but they spend more on foreign aid, and so they're achieving some similar goals in terms of stability, et cetera, globally. leave that aside, but just noting that. So in 2018, the U.S. foreign aid budget was, as you see there, $56 billion. A little up from where it was in 2016. So, and that's the Congress. Trump administration has tried a couple times to engage in cuts, and the Congress keeps coming back with more funding. But this is represents less than 1% of the federal budget. So what people sometimes, the general public, I don't necessarily want to assume any of you guys, but the general public will often say when they're asked, what percentage of the U.S. federal budget goes to foreign aid, they'll say like 10% or 20% or something like that, and it's less than 1% of the federal budget. And if you look at it as a percentage of GDP, which is what makes sense, right? Total wealth versus how much you're giving in foreign aid, the U.S. is around 20th place in the world. So certainly not 200 countries in the world, right? Of course, many of those countries are on the receiving end of foreign aid. But to kind of go back to what I said, this is something the U.S. is criticized for, right? So now what I want to do is shift to a discussion of causes of Southern poverty. So why do we see Southern poverty? Both why do we see it in general? Why do we see it in certain countries? And some of the explanations I'm going to give are kind of static explanations, like why do we see it in general versus why are some countries doing a little bit better than others. I'm going to note, I mentioned there are three explanations. One is kind of the history of empire. Second is dependency theory. And then the final one is modernization theory. And I'm going to give you a hint up front that modernization theory is actually what the Economist news article that hopefully some of you will have read. That's what that article is consistent with. That article is basically like, classic modernization theory. It's not surprising because the Economist is a kind of classical liberal, as in Adam Smith's liberal, not as in, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi liberal. In any case, if that didn't make sense, you don't need to worry about it. Okay, moving right along. So now I'm going to talk here about empire. So the basic story here, I'll give you this one up front, and then we're going to unpack it. But the basic story here is that empire explains poverty, that the historical legacy of the different European empires, mostly European empires, there certainly were some exceptions, but the legacy of these empires is a legacy of poverty. So I'm going to quick switch to this map and then switch back to so this gives you a sense of the world carved up into empires as of 1914. And what you can see is, as of 1914, a lot of Africa, almost all of Africa, is divided up into amongst or by the different European powers, and then chunks of the rest of the globe as well. But certainly Africa. But you do also see Southeast Asia, etc. Okay, so why does empire lead to poverty? Well, there's a couple different stories that we can tell here. First of all, a story about political and social effects. So the idea is that in any of these places around, and you all probably know as well, that the borders themselves, even the countries in Africa, most of them were determined by colonial powers, slicing and dicing the country up. Second yawn of the day. Sorry about that. So pre-existing, so prior to the arrival of the European powers, there was a historically derived social system. There was a political system, and there were, a legal system, etc. Right? This is how we're going to do governance. This is how we're going to choose leadership. This is how we're going to divide our resources, etc. Well, the empire then came in and, of course, kind of destroyed those indigenous political, social networks and systems, rules, etc., put in place an imperial system. Of course, the imperial system, when revolution happened later, most of which was kind of in the post-World War II period, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, the imperial system then is overthrown, but there's no real way to go back because it's been, in some cases, over 100 years since the colonial power arrived. And so you can't really go back to the prior system, but you set up a new system based on what your colonial power, how they run their political and social system. And it seems both artificial, but also lacking in legitimacy. So when people talk, and we'll talk a little bit more later, about things like corruption, about things like lack of rule of law, one of the stories you can tell is that comes from this disruption that happened with when empires came in, uprooted the political and social system for, in some cases, a century or more, and then got up and left the countries essentially in limbo from that perspective, from kind of an institutional evolution perspective. Second, what about the economic effects of empire? Well, most of and granted, there are different empires, different imperial powers. Some colonies were set up, and the imperial powers set them up because they had resources. So the empire basically was a mechanism for going in and extracting resources to send back to the imperial core to sell or to, make that imperial core function more smoothly. So one of the excellent examples here, it's brutal example, is Belgium in the Congo in Africa, and to this day one of the least stable parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and their kind of an imperial engine was driven by extraction back when this is prior to the human ability to manufacture rubber. And so back then you had rubber plants that were used to make tires, etc. And the Belgians went in and basically, this was, the rubber plants were in the jungles were incredibly lucrative, but they were not, unlike, I don't know, let's say pine trees that you can regrow with some regularity. They pretty much were, you tear them out and, you can't regrow them with any kind of like chronological time frame that's economically viable. And so the Belgians went in and they basically made the entire area of the Congo's economy focused on extracting this rubber. That's what everybody was involved in doing until the rubber ran out. And then they, pretty much turned their back on the Congo. So there was no kind of local economic life. There was no alternative to that process. The idea is that in addition, political and economic training, the kind of expertise that you need to run a country and run an economic system properly was in the hand of the colonial powers, sometimes in the hands of maybe a middle class that came. In some cases, the empires would like bring people in from elsewhere to help with some of the kind of the middle level jobs, but rarely would they put local figures in any sort of position of authority where they could develop expertise. Well, then, of course, again, the revolution happens, the empire gets up and leaves, and, fine. I mean, it makes perfect sense why if you're overthrowing an imperial power, you would want those elites that had been governing you to leave, but then nobody locally had any expertise, and that led to pretty massive disruption as well. So that's a story about Southern Poverty. You can buy it or not buy it. That's completely up to you. But if you were to buy it, and with each of these, I'll do this a little bit of a discussion of some of the solutions that come out of these different explanations. And the first one here is that if you really think that the imperial powers are essentially responsible for the current poverty of these countries, then maybe reparations make sense. So foreign aid, it's one thing for foreign aid from countries who just sort of want to help or think that it's a kind of a morally useful thing, but it's also, this would say, maybe necessary for those, again, from a moral perspective, maybe for those countries who were responsible. Okay, so the second theory we're going to talk about of Southern poverty is dependency theory. So here the idea starts with the emphasis from these countries, the emphasis within these countries, excuse me, on agriculture and other commodities. So, and this is a fact that most of the countries that are in poverty, in extreme poverty today, or have a high portion of the population is in poverty, they are agriculturally focused, right? So they grow crops and they sell those crops. Well, the problem with agriculture is that you gain very low returns on investment. So, on even a good year, you're not going to make very much. And so you're probably going to make just barely enough. If you have a good year, you're probably going to make just enough to be able to buy the seed or whatever you need for, maybe, fertilizer, pest control, whatever it is for the next year. So just barely enough to stay afloat. And then that, of course, is assuming, as I just did, that you have a good year. So, of course, what you don't always have is a good year. That is, sometimes when I say good year, what I would mean is like you're able to bring your crop to market, but also that in general, the market isn't saturated. So sometimes if you have really great, let's say, weather, that means that all of your neighbors, neighbors very loosely defined, so everybody else in your country who's generating whatever crop it is, that they also had really good weather, and therefore it's a bumper crop, which means that the prices that you're going to get for those products are going to go down. Or you have a drought or some sort of other, extreme weather event that's going to lead you to not be able to produce it enough. So, the price may be high because people really want their, whatever it is, their sorghum, but there's just not, you just haven't been able to grow enough because of the extreme weather, right? So the fluctuations in price add to this problem of low returns on investment. Now you may say, why does return on investment matter? Well, return on investment is what allows somebody to go from having agriculture to getting to the next level, say, light manufacturing, or maybe even jumping into something that's a more advanced, right? In order to do that, you have to have the capital to, buy some initial equipment, et cetera, and to show that you can, put down payments, et cetera, in order to qualify for bigger loans and all those sorts of things. And if you can't generate those initial gains, then you're not going to be able to get to that next phase. And that next phase is what's necessary in order to make people wealthier, right? So this is a big problem. Now, the follow-on point here is that starting back, when we talked about trade, about the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade that was then replaced by the WTO. And those institutions have not been able to lower tariffs on agriculture like they have in other areas. So, many manufactured goods have very low tariffs at this point in time, but it's not the case for agriculture. And the reason is that farmers in the developed world both are politically powerful, but also that most politicians and governments in wealthy countries see farmers and agriculture really two ways. They see it both as a cultural thing that they want to keep, but also kind of from the perspective of food security, they don't want to be too dependent on others outside for their food. So all of that means that you have relatively high protection in agriculture, which means that developing countries are blocked out. Certainly that is not the case everywhere, and it does seem to be getting better, but it is still a problem. So some will also, in arguing about and making this case on dependency theory, some will also further stress the importance of the kind of former imperial powers and multinational corporations in their, that are based in their territory, basically going into developing countries and exploiting them. So it's not just that they sell agriculture, which has low returns on investment, but that, let's say one of these mega multinationals in France is also responsible for purchasing those products from those goods, those fruits, vegetables, grains, etc., from the African countries where France used to be a colonial power, right? So they talk about kind of neo-colonialism in dependency theory. So the final thing to say here is, again, if what I've said if this second explanation sounds either better to you or it sounds like it's pretty convincing to you, then the question is, what do you do about it? And interesting, I'll just note that there's a little bit of a parallel here to neo-mercantilism, and we talked about Alexander Hamilton last week, and there's a similar idea here, which is that developing countries need to protect as a way to kind of get their sea legs. And so this is kind of like this idea of import substitution industrialization. It's kind of like the infant industry argument that is associated with Alexander Hamilton. So the idea here is that you substitute for imports. So you take something, I don't know, motor scooters, right? And you say, okay, if you put a 100% tariff on foreign motor scooters, and you take those resources and you put them into a government bank that then is going to loan money to a domestic manufacturer of motor scooters, then that company is going to be more likely to get launched in the first place and survive in the medium term. And then down the road, you can always take those and dial those tariffs back to force the companies little by little to become more competitive. But that's the idea with import substitution industrialization. Of course, getting rid of protectionism, particularly in the areas where the poor countries are the most active, so something like agriculture. Obviously, that's politically difficult in the wealthier countries. And then if this idea about former empires and the multinational corporations within them are correct, then you would want to cut those ties. Now, of course, what we're going to hear about next for modernization theory is that countries, and that's the Economist article, that countries should be trying to draw as much foreign investment as they can. So it's obviously at odds with this particular theory. So the final one that we're going to talk about is modernization theory. So as I suggested, those of you who did read that article, you've already got a sense of this. If you haven't read it yet, I would actually just pause and go and read it. So it'll give you a little supplement of everything that I'm about to say. And I should note that this is one, probably more than the other two, that maybe can tell a story, and that's what I liked about that article. It can tell a story about why, if you look at Africa, right, why are there some countries in Africa that are growing, more fastly and growing faster than others, and why are there countries that are experiencing less poverty or over time having fewer people in their country in extreme poverty. So here the idea is, in the kind of the language that you hear people use, is get the basics right. So it's kind of broken down into a couple different categories, but it's a very similar concept throughout, which is that there are characteristics, there are flaws. Some of them are sort of, and modernization theory, by the way, doesn't spend a ton of time on how these flaws got there or what exactly can be done to some of that at the end I'm going to talk about here, some of what can be done to alleviate, mitigate, reduce them moving forward. It pretty much just says, okay, these are the problems that cause poverty in the southern world. So first would be things like corrupt and ineffective leaders, over-reliant on, so, the idea is, and I guess back up, it's very explicit in the news article. I don't think I put it explicitly on here, but one of the things, the idea is, there's two things. There's a domestic economic engine, so the ability of, actors in Kenya, let's say, to start a business themselves, right, Kenyans. But then second, that foreign investment is really important. And foreign investors are looking for opportunities, but they're only going to go in places where they can maximize their return on investment. So if they have corrupt leaders, where they're going to have to, and note, this is both for that domestic actor, this Kenyan who's thinking about opening, a restaurant or a factory or whatever it is. The idea is if he knows, or she knows, that they're going to have to pay bribes, they don't like that because it can often be very unclear exactly how that's going to go, right? That the bribes can sort of vary in price over time, they can scale up, right? And that's hard to build into your business model. Also the case for foreign businesses. That is, they're often troubled by corruption. You might think, businesses love corruption because they just pay somebody off and they get what they want. Well, the problem is, because it's not transparent and it's not legal, it's often difficult to enforce a deal that you make, right? So you pay somebody off with a huge sum of money, and then they just take the money and abscond and go to the Bahamas, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And then you got to pay off the next guy, gal, as the case might be. So corruption's a problem, and modernization theory is going to say you need to solve that. Too much spending, so things like nationalization of industry, right? The article talked about that. This is another thing that contributes to poverty, according to modernization theory. Talked about government spending. So infrastructure is really important. So the countries who have good infrastructure, again, think about this. If you say to yourself, okay, I'm thinking about setting up a chain of clothing stores. I'm a local investor and I've got, money. Problem is I need to get my clothes from X spot where they're being made, or maybe even being shipped into the country, but probably being made, out to these different stores, right? The problem is we don't have a good road system, or we don't have a good rail system, right? So I really can't do that. So I better have to focus on something that's either smaller or, right? So infrastructure is really important. It's also very important for foreign investors because they want to be able to get in, build whatever they're building, or, get the local work done that they need, but then they need to be able to get out with the product as quickly and efficiently as possible. Rule of law, it's kind of consistent with what I was saying before about corruption. If you can't have contracts enforced, it's really hard to have functioning businesses, right? Businesses work on the rule of law and on consistency in a contract being upheld legally. And so these are critical components. Modernization theory would argue. So I should just note, we could, and in another class, by the way, this whole lecture is an entire class, upper level class called Politics of Developing Countries, that my colleague, Professor Laris, teaches. And there, I'm sure she spends at least a class, but probably more than that, on something like modernization theory. But what do you do? So let's, again, take this little sample that I've just given you and say, okay, if this is correct, what do we do to solve the poverty problem? Well, you need to get rid of corruption. You need to build infrastructure. You need to get rule of law. Okay, how do you do that? Well, an interesting option was developed with what was called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which began in the George W. Bush administration. And they have 17 indicators. And so I've just given you kind of some of the more high profile ones, however that is, like 6 there, where they go in and rate countries on these 17 indicators. Now, and then the idea is that countries have a median score across the 17 categories, and the idea is that you have to exceed your peer group for your median score. And when you do, then you're eligible for these Millennium Challenge Corporation funds. So this is basically, it's a chunk of the foreign aid budget that the United States has, a pretty small chunk, but the idea is that it's going to reward the countries that are better than their peers at the things that modernization theory says are important. Now, one thing that's kind of, I think it's worth just taking a second on, is that there is, there's some element to this that's a little, it's sort of twofold, that's a bit perverse. One is that because what we've already said, right, is that if you're better at these things, you got lower corruption than your neighbors, you got good infrastructure, you got good rule of law, you're going to attract foreign investment. So this is basically saying the countries that are already doing pretty well, we're going to also give them foreign aid, right? Which seems kind of weird. And then the other part of it that's a little bit strange about this is, of course, if you're a citizen in a country that doesn't have these things, right? A Sierra Leone, for example, or what did they say in the article? Burundi, right? Right next to Rwanda, but has real governance problems. If you're a citizen in one of those countries, you probably actually don't bear a lot of responsibility for all these problems that your political class that is kind of semi-permanent, right, not receptive to, popular opinion. Basically, your only option is to sort of overthrow them in many of these countries through a revolution, right? Yet here you are just kind of going about your daily business, and the U.S. is basically saying, we're not going to give you foreign aid or that much foreign aid because, of decisions that are outside of your hand. So that part of it is challenging. But of course, from the side of the U.S. taxpayer, you're going to say, well, if countries are doing well on these indicators, that means not only are they already on the right track and we're rewarding them for being on the right track, but second of all, and maybe most importantly for U.S. taxpayers, we know that this money is going to be, or it's less likely that this money is going to go into, lining the pockets of corrupt political officials. So that's pretty much what I had to say on global poverty. Hope you guys are all well out there, and feel free, as always, to put any questions in the discussion link, discussion tab. I know that hasn't happened yet, but always could happen. And like I said, look for on Thursday the written questions on the first selection from Brooks and Walforth. Take care, and have a good rest of your day.